because I think a lot of us are brought up with this average life. Like that's kind of the recipe for a fine life. So when you meet someone, it's like, how are you? Fine. You're not terrible, but you're not great. You're like settling for a 3 when you could have much higher. You just have to get out of your comfort zone. And so that's kind of where we went, is like, okay, what are the tools that we could give people in different areas of their life so that they are their version of whatever their best self is.
Cathryn, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Really grateful for you being here and really excited to dive into your story and talk to you today about Best Self and also everything you're in the middle of in your life and the journey to get to this point. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, it's great to be here. It's great to do a in real life podcast, which is one of the very few I've ever done.
It hits different in person for sure. I love to start with the sale of Best Self, because whenever that happens in an entrepreneur's life, it's like, it seems like a big moment from the outside looking in, but there were a lot of moments to get to that point. What was that moment like in October 2022? And how does it sit with you now, just 4 months later?
So selling your business, the actual technical part of it, of like closing, is very anticlimactic. If anyone's ever done it, first of all, it kind of comes onto the wire. A lot of people I've talked to who've sold their businesses, it's, in the last week between, signing the LOI, due diligence, everything like that, like so much can change. And I'm telling my wife, I'm like, yeah, it could go through, it might not go through. So we'll just have to see. Because, just things are moving all the time. It did go through, but when you're closing, it's all done on DocuSign. So it's like you click a few buttons and then like your business is not your business anymore. And we refinanced our house like a year or 2 ago. We had to go to an office. We had to sign all this paperwork. It took like 30 minutes of signing for a refinance. But like selling your business was like 3 buttons and then that's it. So it was anticlimactic. And I think at the beginning it was hard because, I'm staying on as an advisor, but, I'm removed from the Slack group. I'm not like with my team anymore, which at the beginning, because I'm still advising on things, I'm like, wait, what? I'm not gonna be in the Slack anymore. But I actually think it was good because new leadership want to come in and make it their own, and if I'm still in there, it's kind of weird. And it also allows me to fully step out of it and not be involved anymore. So there was a lot of feelings, and I'm glad I did it for sure.
How do you deal with losing a part of your identity, that your identity was like, I'm a part of this group, I built this, and so now you're removed from the Slack? How does that make you feel, and like where do you go next?
So I'm not sure where I go next. I think not having my team, that was the most difficult, is like not speaking to them every day. And I was pretty much out of the day-to-day, but I could always message them if I needed something or just to check in. And I still like text with them and have good relationships, but it was definitely strange. But at the same time, I do think as an entrepreneur, being able to build something and then have someone see value in it and sell it is actually a huge accomplishment, because, we went through a ton of different things, and, I never went to business school. I didn't learn how to do a business. I was really just figuring out as I went along. And so I'm proud of myself that I was able to do that, and someone saw the value and wanted to buy it. And then also, I think being an entrepreneur is really like the building value and then being able to pass it on to someone else. And so for a long time, I'm an artist, so I'm like in the product, I'm like deep in it. It's like my baby. And I think being able to step away from it and then sell it on to someone that can make it much bigger was something that was difficult, took a while to do, but I'm really happy that I did it.
One of the things that I think separates you is design and your ability to design. And it's something that I'm so jealous of, because I'm like, I wish I could make things look good, but it feels like I've never been able to do that. And so like even in arts and crafts, I was always like struggling and trying to get by. I always knew very early on, this is not something I'm good at. but I know it's important. So like, what do you think makes for a good designer?
So I think some people are, they're born and they're able to like naturally see things. And then I do think just practice. I have a friend who just started teaching himself how to draw. And to be honest, at the start, it was like pretty terrible. And now he's like crushing it and he's doing so well. And so I think a lot of people, you can learn design and you can learn design principles and get better if you really are intentional and practice it. And then a lot of times you notice good design and you don't know why it's good, but you know it's good.
Yeah.
And oftentimes when something's, there's something off, but your brain as a non-designer doesn't know why it's off, but it's like slightly off. And so I think me, when I was starting BestSelf, I was so like in the weeds with everything. Like I remember the first, sample coming in and the bookmark being like, 5 millimeters too long than I said. And I'm going back to them being like, look, this is just unacceptable. We have to get this. I had like a 3D model of the journal originally because I was very precise on everything because I used to be an architect. And so one of the things that I learned in architecture is you never leave anything to assumption because if you leave anything to assumption, they will just assume the easiest, cheapest way to go. And and if you're really specific on your design from like the corner radius to the thickness of the pages, if you don't really specify every single thing that you want, you will get whatever they decide in the factory that day makes sense for them.
Yeah. So in 2013, I believe, you come to New York City.
Yeah, I moved 2012.
2012.
Yeah.
Was that a scary move from you? And where were you moving from exactly?
So I went to uni I did architecture in Newcastle in England, and then I did my postgrad in Scotland. And then I'm from Belfast. So I'd already been away from home for a bit, but I'd always wanted to live in New York. Like that was my goal.
Why?
I went there when I was 18. Actually, my dad, I think when I was like 9, offhandedly said, when you're 18, I'll take you to New York. And I was like an elephant, never forgot. And so, every year, like I'm 11, I'm like, oh, only 7 more years until I get to go to New York.
Oh, wow.
And then the terrorist attacks happened like a year or so before
9/11.
Yeah. And so it was 2000. I'm going to age myself, so I don't remember, but I know my dad was like, well, New York's kind of a little more scary right now. You want to go to Paris or you want to, and I'm like, no, we're going to New York. And so it's the, you make it here, you make it anywhere type thing. And after school, I applied for an internship in an architecture firm in New York. And so I went there because, to get a visa and come over, you basically have to get a job. And so I came for a summer, and then that company hired me. I went back, got my master's, and then they hired me to come back.
And around that same time, you start writing on the internet as well. 2013?
Yeah, I started writing just a blog a year later. I don't know that anyone really read it much, but I kind of was just documenting as I went along what I was doing.
It's 2 core skills I find that like a lot of successful people have: writing and design, right? So like, what did writing on the internet teach you, even if no one was reading it at first?
I think just documenting your thoughts and like why you did the things that you did. And for me, I actually downgraded myself a little bit with my design skills. And, I was like, oh, I literally did not one business class, not even in university or in high school. So I was thinking like, I only know design. I'm not going to be very good at this. And so I was essentially trying to like learn as much as I could and then document so I could go back and figure out where I went wrong.
What do you mean you downgraded yourself?
So I was insecure with my skills because I was thinking, I'm an architect. I know how to design like physical things, but I don't know anything about business or P&Ls or anything like that. And so I was just thinking, how am I going to make this work? Or how am I going to start a business when I literally have no education in this whatsoever.
But it's interesting because when you were selling Dawson Creek CDs when you were, I believe, 13, you didn't even think about that.
Oh yeah, which is kind of funny when I look back of like the little clues that you leave along the way. So I was like very entrepreneurial growing up. Like I was the person in the neighborhood that would like go to people's doors and like ask to mow their lawn or wash their car or whatever. I always wanted to make my own money. And, you know, luckily I lived in a safe neighborhood, and my parents would get calls like, your daughter's here again. Basically like stop her from coming over, even though sometimes it worked out. But like in general, they were like, this is strange. And then when I was 7, I was like selling cupcakes on the playground. And then when I was 13, I somehow became a drop shipper because I wanted to buy some Dawson's Creek DVDs, and they didn't sell them in Ireland at the time or the UK. And I somehow got in touch with someone in Canada on eBay that sold them. And so I became a drop shipper. And like at the time, of course, I'm like 13. I can't get a PayPal account at that age. So my mom like let me set it up under her name. And so I'm getting like checks in the mail and like PayPal things. She's like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm running a business. But then at the same time, I'm only allowed on the computer, you know, an hour a day. And so the first thing I bought whenever I had enough money was like a laptop. Because I was like, I need to run my business in more than an hour a day. And so, but at the time I didn't know that like you could have a job or you could go into retail or e-commerce, because that wasn't a thing. Because nobody in my life had a business or was an entrepreneur. Everyone was, you know, a doctor, a lawyer, very conventional. The idea of like not going to university wasn't even a thought.
But then at some point you moved to New York City and you're like, all right, like I can't start a business. I feel insecure about starting a business, but you were doing it as a kid. So like, why do you think you felt insecure at that point?
Well, because when I'm a kid, I live at home. I don't have any real expenses.
Yeah.
When I moved to New York, I'm thinking, you know, I don't want to have to go home if this doesn't work out. And so I was very careful with my risks. So I stayed in my architecture job until I had a business that was, you know, making more than my job. And I'm not a person to just like quit my job and hope for the best. So that was one thing, is like it was measured risk. And I also took, you know, a 3-month hiatus from my architecture job, thinking, okay, what if I leave this job and I turn into like a total bum, and I like sleep all day, I like don't do anything, and I have nothing to go back to. Of course, like a week in, I was like, oh, I was finishing off a few projects on site, so I wasn't totally done. I was working like 1 day a week, but that Wednesday every week, I'm like, oh my God, I can't wait till these projects are done so I can like just move on and work on my business.
And so what gave you the idea for the business initially?
So the first business, not BestSelf, the first business I was selling like posters and t-shirts and things online of things that I designed. And
is that the Tumblr one?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So it's just like pop culture references, and a couple of friends and I who were also architects, we would just like do fun things on the side, and I would post it on Tumblr and then would make it into posters. But this is before, you know, you had print on demand or anything like that. And so at the start I was doing like commercial printing one-off, which is really expensive. And then I learned about offset printing, which was much like, you know, a 40th of the cost if you just print like 500 at a time. But then I'm shipping it out myself in a New York apartment. So I was like learning as I go. And then eventually I learned what a 3PL was. At one point I had a TaskRabbit that would come to my apartment in the morning and take all of my posters to the post office while I went to my architecture job. And then I would come back. And my architecture job, you know, was like 9 to 8 usually. It was like long hours. God. And then I would come home and like be like packing orders and then start the day again next.
When you look back at those times, is there any part of you that misses it?
I think I missed the initial, like, I didn't know what I was doing. I was just like one day at a time and wasn't thinking big or anything. I was really just like, how do I make this work? So that at the time I didn't even know if I would like leave my job. I was just like, I want to try something. and I was learning a ton, so it was fun in that regard. But I think I got to the point where I was like tired of shipping orders myself. And then I think you have like an energy bar for a business where like once that's depleted, like doesn't matter what you do, like you do not want to work on it anymore. And so I kind of, that was sort of my cash flow business for a bit. And then I, was trying other things. But I think whenever you're in a job and you want to start something, like you don't have to start something that's going to be your forever, I'm going to retire on this. It's like, what's your freedom vehicle to get you out of the job? And then you can figure out what you want to do with the rest of your life.
And so you start, you're like, all right, my energy bar for this business is done. At what point do you say, all right, I'm going to start something that I'm really passionate or excited about? Or what's the next thing? How do you figure out is the next thing BestSelf?
No, the next thing I went into this entrepreneurship course where they were teaching you, the goal of the course was starting a software company. So I went into that. I actually did start one. So it was like you find a problem, you solve it. But it was very much like I learned a ton from it. But the market was like physical therapists and chiropractors. And I didn't really have a passion for it. I learned a ton about like, how to find a problem, build a solution. Not me. I like hired a developer. And then I got to the point where like all I had to do was sell it. And that's when I realized I was a product person. I liked coming up with the idea and like refining it and like talking to customers. But then when it came just selling it, I like realized, this is not for me.
It's so interesting because there's some part of, I resonate so much with what you're talking about, where it's like, that the right thing or doing the right thing is possible in certain avenues, but your just heart won't let you do it.
Yeah.
What is that?
I think it's really just managing your energy. And if you're not excited about it, it's very difficult to move. It's hard to get momentum when you don't have any excitement around it.
Yes.
And now I just listen to that, because even at the end of BestSelf, for me, there was people were like, oh, you could do this and this and this. And I was like, yeah, I could. And I just could not. I couldn't, like, the momentum in me to do it. I was just excited about other things. And that's when I realized, like, oh, now's the time to move on from it and because I didn't want it to, like, die with me. I wanted it to grow into something much bigger. And I knew personally that I didn't have the bandwidth as a leader to take it there.
How do you get better at getting in touch with your own energy? Because a lot of times people are going through jobs and doing things and they're not thinking about what's giving me energy and where do I want to live most authentic to me. I feel like you're very good at that, because there's things that in your life where you're like, all right, I could do these things, but I'm not. Or this poster business isn't giving me energy. Or I can't sell this and it's not giving me energy. I think that is really the secret of like figuring out how and where you get energy from. And a lot of people don't know how to do that.
I mean, I think it's difficult because sometimes it's like you go through hard times in your business.
Yeah.
Where you're not going to have energy all the time. Like things are going to be hard. But if you're still aligned with the mission of the company and that gets you excited, and you're also willing and see a vision of you working in it in the future. Like for BestSelf, I'd been there, it was 7 years of it. And I think I was just ready for a new challenge.
Yeah.
I also have ADHD, so that's also a problem where I'm like, oh, what's the next thing? And it was too much. Okay, I figured out a bunch of this stuff and now I want to try a new challenge.
So when do you start BestSelf, and how does that idea come to be, and how do you start working on it and get excited about it?
Yeah, so that was in 2015, and I had been using my own, like, how I plan my day I'd read like a ton of business books and personal development books, and as a designer, I was thinking, okay, like, let me design a framework for myself for my day so that I know, okay, if I do all of these things, I'm going to hit this goal that I have, or I'm going to actually take the things that I've read in books and implement them in my life, but not have to think about it every day. So it's like removing the friction of, am I doing the right things? And so I tried to, structure the morning gratitude and like how I'm planning my day and like today's 3 top things. So now, like, 2023, this is all pretty standard stuff. But I think at the time, it wasn't something that you could just buy in a journal form. And so I was doing it in a moleskin for a while, and I got to the point where I was tired of writing, basically the framework into a moleskin. And so I'm like, I could just design this in InDesign. And so that's what I did. And I had actually a background, like my thesis project in architecture school was designing a book. And so I was able to take those skills and use them for this. So once that was done, I was showing it to a friend, and anyone I showed it to wanted to have one also.
It's a good sign.
But whenever I went to, see how much it would cost to make, it was like going to be so expensive. And so that's why I decided to go to Kickstarter, because I'm thinking, well, if I can pre-sell a certain number of units, then I will be able to get my version, and then my friends will also get them at a reasonable price. And so the goal with the Kickstarter was just, okay, let's get this made for myself.
And your dad asks you, like, why would people pay for things when they don't have them, right? Because it's like a gap in how generations think, I guess, because it's a reasonable question if you've never heard of Kickstarter.
Yeah, it was like, well, why would they buy something before it exists? I'm like, well, people buy concert tickets before a concert, and if the concert tickets don't sell enough, then they don't have the concert. And so I think crowdfunding is a great way to, you're not giving up equity, you're basically pre-selling units before they exist to make sure that you're not going to buy a bunch of stuff that's going to end up in your garage, or people say they will buy it, and then it comes time to actually take out their wallet and they won't. And so it's a good way to validate that you're solving a real problem and that this product is something that people want.
So cool. At what point did you realize you had something? And like, obviously your friends validated it, but was there a moment in the first year or two where you're like, oh, wow, like this is going to be big?
Well, I mean, I think the Kickstarter funded in like 28 hours.
Yeah.
We hit like $15,000. And then in the next 30 days, we did like 322,000 or something like that, which was insane. And
so you have $300,000 basically in your bank account, or it's held in Kickstarter? How does that work?
Basically, when the campaign is over, they will just send the money to your account minus their like credit card fees or and then their 5% fee that they take.
Now,
then you have to figure out, okay, I have to deliver all this product to these people in the time period that I said that I would.
Was that stressful?
Oh yeah, because I tell people now when they're launching a Kickstarter is to leave a lot of room for error and do not promise to have something by Christmas time if the campaign ends in September. And so that was one of the things, is like, we actually did deliver all of the North American rewards in time. It was the European people that I think they got it like 2 weeks after Christmas or something like that, because it just took longer to get to them. But yeah, that was the first challenge of like dealing with supply chain, containers. We had to like change containers like in the nth hour, because they were like, well, we're not going to be able to get this until December 20th, and that's shipping in November. I'm like, I was like, what's this? Like, show me the map here of like where they're going, because this doesn't make any sense. Why are we on the literally like the longest ship option there is? And so, containers, you move them from one boat to the other, but last minute it was like, yeah, we're not going to get on this boat. This is too long. And we managed to still find a boat that was on a shorter, getting to the U.S. quicker, and then we trucked it to where we needed it to be.
You found a boat that like just randomly to like...
Well, yeah, you can just Google and like find other boats that are leaving from the same port. And it's 7 years now, so I don't remember the details, but we did get it in a reasonable time.
Well, that's the thing. I feel like your memory is so incredible to remember some of the stuff that happened 7 years ago. Like, do you think that, is there anything you've done to improve your memory, or like, because the way you talk about some of this stuff is like, oh, it just happened yesterday.
Oh, I think it's just, I forget a lot.
Really?
And it's only when I something happens, I'll be like, oh yeah, I remember this. I think journaling helps with that and remembering things, but also just having conversations of like, oh, supply chain. The first time I realized this was a thing, maybe it was just trauma of like being up at like 1 a.m. trying to decipher like, Chinese boats leaving and like where they're going to go. So it's probably trauma.
That makes sense. But journaling actually really does help. And like something I've started to do this year is just every day at the end of the day, write down what happened, like, or the impactful moments. Never done that really before consistently. And I find, wow, like this is incredible. Like this is an obvious thing that you obviously stumbled on 8-10 years ago, but I think it's something that when you actually consistently do, it transformed me, like in the sense of my memory's better and I can really picture myself at different points in my life. So like you were, I believe, the first person or the first company to ever put out 13-week journals. And that idea came from you, and now it's like a common thing. Take me through that.
Yeah, so after we came out with it, a lot of people were like, oh, that's smart business decision. You make them buy 4 times a year instead of 1. And that was a very smart business decision, but it was done out of a structure of not seeing your year, planning a year up front, and instead planning in 3-month chunks, because a year is too long you have too much time to procrastinate. So you should be breaking, even if you have a big goal, you can break it down into, okay, what am I going to do in 3 months? Like imagine you set your yearly goal in January of 2020, right? And then COVID comes. It's like, oh, there goes your plan. Whereas actually, if you had started a self-journal 1st of January, by March, COVID hits, you have a new journal and now you can pivot. And so I think it was important to sort of teach the structure of like breaking down goals and sort of controlling the inputs to get there. And so that was why we did it. And, 13 is just a quarter of 52. So that's where it came from. But it is funny because like I came up with the concept of, okay, 13 weeks. And now I do see it on Facebook ads and other people that also have journals. But it's just funny because that's where it came from.
Well, it's funny because independently, I came up with something in, I think, June of 2020 called the 3-month rule, which is just like who you are today. 80% of it is based on the actions you've been taking for the past 3 months. You could have been an entirely different person 9 months ago, but you're not really living as that person most of the time. You're living as the things you've been doing for the past 3 months. You realize that obviously as well. I'm curious, how does the business change as you change, right? So at one point you're like, all right, I'm into personal development and growth and becoming the best self. But then like, I'm sure relationships change and you have different facets of your life that become more important. How do you grow and the business grow and you still have both grow as well?
I mean, I think at the beginning of BestSelf it's kind of like how we are and how we're brought up. It's very like type A, hit your goals. Like, are you doing well? Like, what's your job going to be? And so it's very much like external versions of success of like, this is the goals that I want to hit. And what I realized is, I was sort of forward thinking. I didn't call the company the self-journal company. I called it BestSelf because I'm thinking, okay, first of all, I don't want to have just one product. And then I also want to have a whole product line. And what's the goal in general is to be your best self. But what I realized at the beginning, it was very much like be your most productive self, which is actually not your best self. And I realized that because, the business was going great and, we're winning these awards and everything's great externally. But at the time I was like going through a separation, getting divorced. And, as far as divorce goes, it was like somewhat amicable and we're still friends. But it still is like my whole life was changing. And publicly it looked amazing. And privately I was just like, this sucks because I have this, success out, external success. And I feel like I don't have anyone to share it with and I don't have this depth of relationship. And so I kind of took that back to BestSelf and thinking, okay, well, if I'm feeling this, I bet other people are too. So what are the tools that I could, or what could I study and research and become better at relationships, both like with my family, with a future partner, with future kids. And so that's kind of where the business ended up going, is like, okay, let's look at relationships. And then sort of a rebrand from, you know, we like changed the whole branding of the company from very like structured productivity to more, okay, what does your best self mean to you? Because I think a lot of us are brought up with this average life. Like that's kind of the recipe for a fine life. So when you meet someone, it's like, how are you? Fine. You're not terrible, but you're not great. You're like settling for a 3 when you could have much higher. You just have to get out of your comfort zone. And so that's kind of where we went, is like, okay, what are the tools that we could give people in different areas of their life so that they are their version of whatever their best self is.
I love that. What were some of the resources that you leaned on when you wanted to learn more about relationships and relationship with yourself and internal growth?
I mean, for the relationships, you know, I think going to therapy yourself and realizing like your patterns and what you've taken from your childhood. I think Gottman is a person that's like probably the highest regarded doctor of relationships and has studied it for 50 or 60 years, and is, you know, one of his things is he basically talks about this very small thing where he can know if a couple are going to stay together or get divorced is turning away versus turning towards someone. So like if my wife was like, oh, this crazy thing happened today, or oh, check out that bird in the tree, and I just ignore her, that's turning away. And whereas if I'm like, oh, that is a crazy bird, or yeah, tell me about that, like those small things, if you do it more turning towards than turning away, predicts a much higher rate of success in your relationship.
That's super cool. I've never thought about that before. What was that guy's name?
John Gottman.
John Gottman. That's awesome. And what other things have you done for your internal relationships? You have John Gottman, going to therapy. Is there anything else?
I think journaling.
Journaling, yeah.
I mean, we also hired like relationship experts to help with the product. So it wasn't just me, because at the beginning it was like, well, this is overwhelming. I also am not an expert in this. Yeah. And so just hiring people that know more. So we came out with a how do you teach your kids growth mindset, and we worked with a child psychologist on how to do that and like simple exercises. So with the company, it also grew from, oh, this is a structure I use to plan my day, to, okay, let's pull in experts, and how do we use experts to create great products, not that we are the experts.
I love that. When you think about like the trajectory of the company and where it went, how much of it was top down versus bottom up?
I think at the beginning, top down and bottom up were the exact same thing, because there was just, you know, me and my business partner, and then I think we hired a couple people early before we knew what we were doing. And then Monica, who was on our team, she ran our customer experience. She actually started with us in June 2016, and she still is at the company now. So I think it started, you know, top down as far as like culture and what we sort of believed in. But I think, you know, the fact that the team is essentially still together and I'm not there anymore means that it became bottom up because it had to.
The reason why I ask that is because I feel like sometimes we think that we can plan our way to where something is going to go, but it often takes a different form than what we entirely expect. And I just find that interesting. And I don't know if that's the case, but it's just like a hypothesis that I have about it, about business in general and just life in general.
Yeah, and I don't think the success of the company, like it wasn't like we are going to, you know, whenever I would set these like arbitrary goals, it was never based on anything. It was just like, oh yeah, we should definitely grow more this year. But it was like when we were solving a real problem. And so, you know, like our first year, we went from like 0 to like 2.2 million, I think, in sales, which was like big. And then we like 3 or 4x the next year. And so what was crazy was once you get to that point, the idea of slowing down or dipping is like, oh my God. And so then what happens is oftentimes to grow more, you're like, okay, I have to come up with more products. And then because you're trying to drive revenue rather than really thinking about like thoughtful, meaningful products, what you will do is you just start creating like what I call Me Too products, which are just not special to you. So they're just, what can I put my logo on that I could sell to my customers? And so and this was in 2017, and that's when I was going through like my personal stuff. So I feel like my head wasn't even in the business so much as far as like the product. And I ended up going for 3 weeks to Thailand, did like a whole eat, pray, love, like fasted for 8 days, like just took some time away. And I came back and I realized we'd been working on like all these Me Too products. So it was like laptop cases and hoodies and all this just stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, would I buy this? No. So why am I trying to sell it or make it? And we're bootstrapped, so like we don't have just money to just burn on these products that I think of like tier C products. They're like tier A products are what people will come find you for. So it's like the self journal, the intimacy deck. Tier B products serve tier A products. They're like accessories that like make it better. And then tier C are for people that are already fans of your brand, but they're not like Jack off the street is not coming to buy like a logo or a hoodie with your logo on it because they don't even know you. And so if you're spending 80% of your time on tier C products, then your company is not going to make it. And so what I realized, there was a couple of things. Is first of all, we were spending too much time on this. And part of that was driven by trying to drive revenue. Part of it was driven by cadence of meetings. And having a product meeting with a marketing meeting every single week was driving like the product team to feel like they had to push something forward.
I see.
And the only thing you're going to push forward in 5 days is products that don't require a lot of depth or thought. And so I ended up like scrapping those and just doing like brainstorming meetings with the product team and only updating the marketing team like once a month with what we were thinking about. And that was better because now we didn't need to show progress. Because like progress with product, like sometimes it's not like you can sit down 11 a.m. I'm going to create a new product. It's like you have to think and like to create something that's actually going to make a change and be meaningful and be a real tier A product requires more time and more thought and is not something that you can really like schedule to go over with your marketing team every single week.
That's such a good insight. What are the other ways you found to be more creative or come up with tier A products or things that people really want and are solving real problems in people's lives?
I think part of it is just keeping your eyes open. So one thing that I had the team do is like whenever like products are really just solving problems. So if we had a running list in a Google Doc or a Google spreadsheet of just like problems we'd have throughout the week, 99% of which are not going to be solved by us, but just out of like curiosity. I think, one of the things I was like, we started as BestSelf, like who knows where this could go. MailChimp started as like a spinoff of like an agency, I believe. And so I was just kind of getting them the mindset of like, let's just start writing down our problems and then see where it goes.
Such a good idea. Like I have to highlight it because like we do all these things and we're like, oh, it should be this way instead of that. But we don't often stop to be like, all right, like how could it be different? Or like, this is my problem. And then it gives you like a list to look back on. That's genius. That's really smart. And it's so simple that anyone can do.
Yeah. And I think another thing I changed was like when we moved away from like tier C products is like becoming a problem first company and not a product first. So if we're, solving problems, we don't need to sell the solution to our customers. Sure, some stuff will be a physical product that we can sell. Some stuff can be content. Some stuff could be things that we give away for free. So how are we solving the problem? And is the thing that we're creating the best way to do it, or are we just trying to make money? And so there's a difference there of like, how is this best solved? And then decide, is it a product that we sell? Not, oh, how do we make this problem and do a product that we can sell our customers? And I think that also pivoted to really thinking of higher level things.
What's an example that comes to mind from actually doing that?
So one thing is we had these like blank journals, like basically our version of the moleskin. And I'm thinking, okay, how do we sell more of these? So one of the things I'm thinking of, okay, what problems do people have with journaling? Is like, oh, they sit down on a blank page and they don't know what to write, or they end up writing the same thing. And so I'm thinking, oh, let's come up with questions they could ask themselves. And actually, this is how we completely pivoted the company and came up with a whole new product line, is this idea of like, okay, how do we basically remove this problem of starting to journal? And people were like, oh, well, maybe we come up with a guided journal where we put questions inside of a journal. And I'm like, yeah, however, if I open this journal and it's a question I'm not really feeling in that day, and then I have to skip a page, like that's annoying. So it's like really thinking of like how people are going to use it. And then it came to, oh, let's just put them on cards. And then if you pick a card where you don't like the question, you just put it back and you pick another one. And so the first version of what we call now the discovery deck started as these different problem solving things. One was like how to journal, how to come up with ideas, and then how to make decisions. And that they ended up, we were making them in the US like really cheaply. They didn't even look that good, but they were selling. And we were printing like 1,000 at a time, and we would sell out. And then we went to our manufacturer and we like made the quality much better and just made it a much better product because now we knew it would sell. And then in one of our product brainstorming, like I think one of my team was like, you know what people do more than journal is they have conversations, and like what conversations are the most important. And that's when we got into relationships, like with your kids, with your, and then we had products for each one. And then once we had sort of general products for each one, then we can go deeper in that. So it was like intimacy deck started as let me jump into like conversations with my partner, and then relationship journals like, okay, let me take them through a journey to make their relationship better. And so like going wide and then going deep in different areas where you have traction is a great way to come up with more products.
So powerful. And I feel like conversations really are the center of our lives, and we often don't think about how to make them as meaningful as possible. And it's what I try to do with questions and help people, spur people like, okay, that was an interesting question. Maybe I'll use that in my day-to-day life. Like that makes me so happy when I hear that. What have you found for creating connection and helping people create connection, for questions to ask or things to consider when they're just in their day-to-day life?
I mean, I think in general, like we don't learn how to ask questions in school. In fact, oftentimes we're told not to question things.
That's true.
And I think in any relationship, if you're like spending a lot of time with someone, you end up almost getting into a rut conversation wise. And then there's also egos involved. And I think one great thing with the products that we created with these cards is like these in-depth questions where the ego is kind of taken out of it, because I'm not asking you this question and your brain's not saying, well, why is she asking me that? What does she know? Like, what does she think? It's really like from a more clear place where it just allows people to have conversation without feeling like, okay, why? I mean, my brain goes there. If I get a question, sometimes is like, I'll like map it back in my head of, first of all, where did this come from? And then I might answer differently, right? I mean, I'll be as honest as I can, but definitely where something comes from will change how you answer and who's asking. And so I think one of the reasons why people like it so much is because both it gets them out of their conversation rut and has them ask things that, we had people that have been married for 30 years that were like, oh my God, I didn't know this about my partner. Basically, because it's easy just to get caught up in the same conversation. And so I think permission and time and intentionality around questions is something that I probably haven't started doing until like the last few years.
Wow. So 2017, 2018 seemed like darker times of the business and yourself, and then you were able to get out of it in some way. You mentioned going away to Thailand to figure yourself out, to go inward, to eat, pray, love. What was the next step? And like, how do you build momentum when you are coming out of a dark place in your life?
That's a good question. I mean, I think at the time, it's just figuring out what the next thing is. And honestly, at one point, just trying to stay in the game is what all you have to do is stay in the game and then figure out the next thing. And so I didn't know where it was going to go. I just knew like default to action as far as like what's the next thing. And I didn't know any, I didn't have a map or like, oh, we're going to grow to this much. It was just like, okay, this is what I'm thinking. And it was very much like building the plane as you ride it.
Yeah, we often have to do that. We often don't. It gets overwhelming if you have all these visions and all these plans, but it's the day to day that really matters and is all there ever is, the present moment. So take me now through like selling the company. You did, and now you're going to the next phase, or you're building something else. Like, I feel like there's a lot of entrepreneurs out there who are like, all right, I sold my baby, and now let me go to something else right away. But it seems like you're taking more space and trying to really think thoughtfully about like where you're going next. How do you go about doing that?
I mean, I think when I started BestSelf, I didn't know I was going to do it for 7 years. So not that, I love that I did it and I grew it, but I think I want to be more intentional with like, okay, if this ended up being a 7-year thing, because I have ideas all the time. Like I have like oh, what? This is I mean, whenever I have a problem, I'm like, okay, how could this be a business? But I'm like, I don't love that problem that much. And so I think I've never actually had time to think and like not know what the next thing is. I've always had overlap of like, okay, I've always known what the next thing is because the idea of like standing still was scary. And I think that now that I have a little time, I want to be more thoughtful. And I also want to just have some time to learn and like have fun and be curious. And then I know I'll land into something. I just don't know what that will be. But if I jump into the first sort of idea that I have, I think that would be a mistake.
Well, I think when you're young, you just explore opportunities and your ability to just go and be energized by a poster business or a SaaS company. You're like, all right, I can do it. And what I've realized is as I've gotten older, it's like, well, that's a problem, but that's not the problem that I should be solving at this point in my life. So I really admire that. What has been the biggest challenge over the past few months of selling the company? And now it's like, has there been challenges or has it been smooth sailing since you've sold it?
There has been challenges, but not really in the sale process, apart from I'm really bad with paperwork. And oftentimes with sales, it's like an asset purchase. It's not a stock purchase. So I still own the underlying company. They just don't have any stuff in it anymore. So I have to like do all the boring closing down sales tax in different states, like all the stuff that like sucks that I used to have a team to do. Now I don't have that anymore. So I've been doing a lot of that. I also had a baby like 10 months ago. So I've been
congrats
doing that. And just, I moved house recently. So I've just been doing life things, but I do find myself getting a little impatient with the life stuff. And I'm like, okay, like I want to, work on something. And I think as far as whatever I work on next will be something that I just cannot stop working on. So it'll just be like, there's not really a choice of me to do it or not to do it because I'm just so excited about it. And I think that's the difference between like when you should do something is when you literally can't help but work on it.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. Talk to me about becoming a parent. What's that experience like? And what have you found to be the best ways to raise a 10-month-old in the past 10 months?
I mean, it's like wild. I still find myself being like, I created that thing. I also think as like a female entrepreneur, having a baby is very much a challenge because now your time isn't your own. Like, I can't believe I used to talk to parents about morning routines and productivity, I'm like, you should have punched me in the face. Like, once you have a baby, it's just like your mornings are just absolute mayhem. And like, my baby's like pretty chill, but your just time is not your own anymore. And I think you just have to be a much more, there's no like hanging around on YouTube, and like, you're just much more like, I only have 3 hours of my day to do this, so I have to do it. I think as far as, I mean, she's 10 months, so she's, you know, crawling, trying to, you know, standing, trying to walk. So I think, you know, one thing is just babies are so curious. And as parents, it's like, okay, it's annoying, their curiosity, because they get into everything. But I've learned to be like, no, this is a great thing, because I think curiosity is like, it's one of my core values, and it's one of the things that I think a lot of successful people have, is just like, and I think every baby probably has it. So trying to like put them in a playpen, I mean, of course, sometimes you have to put them somewhere so that you can get stuff done, but like really trying to let them be curious is something that I'm learning. And, you know, just being patient. And as a parent, you also see like where, like, what your patterns are that you could be better at. And so I've definitely, it's like you hold up a mirror to yourself, and I'm much more like, okay, what could this be teaching her about this thing? Actually, one thing, this is gonna be so weird. So I'm a big believer, you know, like the compound effect of everything. So you said like the 3 months is who you are today. I actually think like the last few years is who I am today. And if I could do today over, like if today was compounded, how would it be? So every time I buy something, I'm like, okay, if I use this every day, is my life better or worse? And one thing I looked at is like my wife and I would listen to like true crime podcasts a bunch. And it started from when we were moving and we're packing, and we'd be like, oh, we'll just put on this true crime podcast, which is just like a very popular trend with women. But whenever I had Quinn, even when I was pregnant, I was like not wanting to listen to true crime around her. Wow. Because I was like, I don't want that getting into her brain. And then I was like, well, wait, if I don't want it getting in her brain, is it a healthy thing for me? And I realized that like what had started as like packing and listening to was now taking up too much of my time. So instead of listening to a podcast or like an audiobook, which is what I used to do, I would be listening to this true crime stuff, which is fine, but it's kind of like junk for your ears. And it's all about like how the inputs control the outputs. And that was actually something that I realized at the end of last year, was like, oh, I'm actually going to not do that anymore. And because of, and again, no judgment on anyone else. This stuff is fun and it's interesting to learn all the ways you can get murdered. But for me, I realized like, oh, I need the compound effect of me doing this all the time. I think is a net, it's like at best a neutral, but at worst it's net negative. And so I started actually listening to your podcast, which I was like texting you things as I just recently moved, and so I've been listening to it a ton.
So
cool. Like, this is a great episode.
I love it. I appreciate that so much. Well, when you think about the other inputs that are important to you, you mentioned like podcasts and high value sources. What other things come to mind? Because I'm in full agreement with you that the inputs create the outputs.
So for me, something I realized about myself was I am a morning person. I mean, I've known that for a while, but with the baby, I just wasn't getting up early. I also, in our old house, my wife would wake up if I woke up early, and so I wasn't. But then I'm frustrated because I'm like, that's when I'm productive. If I'm getting up before everyone else and getting stuff done, if I did nothing else the rest of the day, I'd still feel good. And so just realizing, like, again, that whole managing your energy thing. And so like getting up early for me was important, like working out. Now I have to get 10,000 steps a day while going for a walk. With the challenge I forced myself to do a year or two ago, it was just like forcing yourself to go for a walk without a podcast. And again, I used to fill my time with like either, true crime podcast or something else, where now it's like, what if I just let myself think? And that's been like a game changer, because so the reason we get such great ideas in the shower is because it's like a meditative state where we're doing something. So instead of like washing the dishes and listening to a podcast or a book, like actually just letting yourself think is one of the most valuable things.
I've found that as well. And I always tell people, turn the podcast off and listen to yourself, because that's really most important. But why do you think that actually works so well?
I think it's because we don't give ourselves time to think, and we're not letting ourselves get bored. And then it's when we're bored is when our minds will wander, and then it'll, think of things differently, or think of ways we're showing up that could be different. Even sometimes when like something annoys me or someone annoys me, like I know that that's something that I'm doing, not something that they're doing. So I'm like, why am I triggered by this person, or why am I triggered by this thing? And if you just, when you're doing the dishes, instead of listening to something, be like, when was the last like 3 times someone annoyed me? And be like, I wonder what could I be doing that is triggering that? Like, it's always me. It's always something that like either I'm not doing, they're doing something I wish I had made time to do, or whatever. And I think you just get a lot of self-reflection when you take time to do that stuff.
What makes you cringe is actually what you wish you could do in some respect. I remember always cringing when people put themselves out there and we're speaking or doing, I'm like, oh wow, like looking back, it's obvious that.
Well, I had the exact same thing.
Yeah.
Actually, have you ever done Landmark?
No, I've heard about that a bunch of times, but what is that?
It's this like personal development thing I did in New York. It's actually one of the cheaper personal development things I've ever done. And it does come off a wee bit culty when you're in it, but it was great. I actually went through it when I was getting divorced, and I just realized all the stuff about myself, and it was like, oh my God. It's like you learn your operating system and how it has worked your whole life, so that you can be like, well, that doesn't make sense anymore.
So what was so impactful about it, and like why do you think it resonated so deeply 4 years later, 5 years later?
I forget their term for it, but it was like, one of the stories that I had about myself was, I have a older brother, and he has like Asperger's, and so my parents were always like a lot of focus on him. I came second, and then my younger brother third. But whenever they would always want him to make sure he learned something first, so that he didn't feel bad. And so I remember once they had been trying to get him to tie his shoe or something like that. And I learned how to, I'd taken my mom's shoes and I learned how to tie the knot or whatever. And I brought it into her, and she was like, oh, put that in the cupboard so your brother doesn't see. And in my mind, what that message taught me was like, oh, you can't talk about yourself or your achievements, or you will make someone else feel bad.
Wow.
And so, I've told my mom this, she's like, oh my God. But it's just this idea of like these tiny things that are like can completely change how you think about yourself. And so what that would do is like, oh, I'm a product person. I hate being salesy. I hate selling. I hate talking about myself. And at the time, I remember I had made friends with this woman, and she was like a makeup artist at the time, and still is actually. But I literally had just met her maybe a month or two before. And at the time that I went through Landmark, we had won the Shopify Build a Bigger Business, and so we got to go to Fiji and like ring the New York Stock Exchange bell and do all this amazing stuff. And so when I went through Landmark, she'd also gone through it, and so I told her this story of like, oh, I realized that I like don't like talking about myself, and I just cringe whenever I hear other people being like, very I don't know what the word is, like
self-promotional.
Yeah. And so what she said was like, oh my God, this is the stories that people tell. She's like, I was thinking that I was seeing all this stuff on your Instagram. You're like hanging out with Damon John and Tony Robbins, doing all this amazing stuff. And you weren't mentioning anything like that in person to me. And I'm thinking like, oh, she doesn't want to talk to me about business because I'm a makeup artist.
Wow.
And And like it was just that one thing of like how you are showing up and then what stories people are saying about themselves or you. It's crazy. And like we all think in stories.
And there are more perceptions of our stories than ever before.
Yeah.
How do you go about identifying the stories that are running your life, but you don't even realize it?
Sometimes you have to have a third party tell you the stories. And, you know, I think having, like I have a really close friend, Frank, and we have had standing weekly calls, just like a 30-minute call on our calendar for the last 6 years.
Wow.
And so, you know, he also runs an e-com store. And so we have a lot of, you know, sometimes we talk about business, sometimes we talk about like personal stuff or like life stuff going on. And I think having someone that's kind of seen different parts and you're like, hey, what ways am I showing up that you've noticed? And I think depth in relationships, if you have that with someone, they're going to be able to point out your blind spots much easier than you.
That's a really good suggestion. What are those meetings like? And like, do you have any structure to them? Or is it just like talk about whatever comes to mind? Is it free flowing? Are there questions? Like, I know it's just 30 minutes, but it could be a really impactful practice for people listening.
Yeah. So I mean, it's mostly free flowing. We don't do it on Zoom. We do it on a phone call, old school style. And that's because we both have Zoom fatigue. And actually we've always done it. And it's just nice because usually I'll go for a walk and be on a call. And occasionally, like, we'll both have noted something down if we want to talk about something specific. Otherwise, it's kind of free-flowing. So sometimes it's, like, recently, like, him asking advice on something business-related, and then we just talk about his thing for 30 minutes. Or whenever I was going through, like, a bunch of different business challenges, he would, like, help me through that. And so I think it depends who needs help at the time. And then sometimes it's, like, literally... we don't have a ton to talk about as far as like things that are different, but we just kind of check in with each other.
Super cool. You mentioned curiosity was one of your core values before, and I'm curious what your other core values are, and also how someone should best go about figuring out for themselves what core values are important to them.
Yeah, so I actually only figured out my core values a few years ago, and I actually, you know, Jay Papasan, he's in Austin. He co-wrote the One Thing book, and I was introduced to him, and so he kind of walked me through this exercise that he did with these cards, and BestSelf and him ended up co-creating the One Thing core values deck because I was like, oh, this is amazing. And my 3 are curiosity, impact, integrity.
Love it.
So, and it was funny because he was like, oh, I thought one of yours would be creativity because I'm very into like making things. But I was thinking, well, a lot of times you can have one core value that combines a bunch of things. So curiosity, I think, drives a lot of what I do. And then curiosity to build things, building them with integrity, and then creating an impact. And so I think they sort of feed each other.
Super in alignment. What suggestions do you have for people who are trying to figure out for themselves?
I mean, I don't want to promote the core values deck, but I do think it's really helpful.
Yeah.
So you could purchase the core values journal. There's a deck that we sell. I also think, you know, you can go online and there's a bunch of words. And essentially the reason why the cards are so good is because it's something physical you can do. And initially you just want to go through them and be like, yes, no. It's a very like gut instinct.
And there's 100 questions or 150?
There's like 150 words. And then you get it down to like 12 by just like literally yes, no. And then you get down to 3. And that's by, you know, we ask you a bunch of questions as far as like, how do you get there? But essentially you're trying, and again, like some people's could be love, family, you know, you could have 5 that kind of, oh, this actually all goes onto this word. And I think that's, people don't be like, well, your family's not in there. It doesn't, like, do you hate your family? It's like, no, like, you know, impact or love or something could have like a bunch of different words under it, but this is the concise version of saying that.
Yeah, and it's helpful to have that top of your mind as well. I've been meaning to do something like this for a long time. What should I search to?
Just go to bestself.co and core values.
BestSelf.co, core values. Awesome.
I'll hook you up. Don't worry.
I appreciate that. Okay. I like to end these podcasts with a challenge. A challenge points to the place in your heart you think that people could take this conversation and do something in their day-to-day life and actually make a change or make an impact. Because you listen, that's great, but do something with it. And does a challenge come to mind from anything we've spoken about?
For the next week, if everyone, with the stuff that you buy and the things that you do, if you just score it like plus, neutral, negative, and see like how your actions are going to compound over time. So if you were to do the same week every week for the next year, like, would you be better or would you be worse?
I love this advice so much. Something that I've started to do since I've been journaling every day or writing down the things that I've done every day is rank the day from +2 to -2. I haven't spoken about this, but I got it from Jim Collins on Tim Ferriss's podcast. And just a +2 is like an incredible day, and a -2 is like an awful day. And if you track this for a month, you could see like where you're going to end up. And I think it's such an impactful practice if you do plus, minus, and 0. So cool.
Yeah.
It's such a great idea. Kat, thank you so much for your time, like your wisdom. You've clearly put a lot of time and thought and energy into building yourself, building your business, and building your life. And I'm so grateful that it all shone through in this conversation. And I'm super grateful for you. Where can we send people to connect with you further?
Yeah, well, if I mention any products, they're on bestself.co. And if you want to just reach me, I'm at littlemight.com or find me, Cathryn Lavery, on Twitter.
Little Might. What's the quick story behind Little Might?
I think it came from like not wanting to be self-promotional. So for some reason, like it was like an alter ego, because I feel like, I'm pretty small. Don't disregard the boots. I'm pretty small. And I think that in general, like I'll get underestimated a lot, which I actually kind of like, because I feel like then I show people what I can do. And so that's where the idea of Little Might came. And I just stuck with it.
I love it because like when you're just starting something, it can be intimidating to put your name or face behind it. But if you can create an alter ego or something on the side, it can really push you to take those steps. So I think that's like
it's
great.
It's also my first name, Cathryn, is spelled differently. So I don't have to want to spell my name to everyone. So Little Might was just easy.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Well, littlemight.com.
Yeah.
Linked below, as well as all your links. Thank you so much for your time. So grateful for you. And so excited for people to listen, enjoy, and rank their days after listening to this conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Danny.